This week's episode is brought to you by Credit Karma. So when's the last time you checked your credit scores? Because your scores may change more often than you think, and you should know what they are now and not from a year ago. Credit Karma is here to help out. The best thing? Credit Karma is always free and there's no catch. No credit card needed. Go to creditkarma.com or download the Credit Karma app now.
The podcast where we talk to smart people, but not necessarily done by smart people.
That is an awesome question.
This one goes down probably on one of my top 5.
Hey, I like nutrition. I like to eat food. This is the coolest thing ever. We're going to do this forever.
I wish I paid more attention in that class.
You know, I'm going to be honest, I don't understand that. As a man, I don't get it.
Welcome to smartpeoplepodcast.com.
Hello and welcome to Smart People Podcast, conversations that satisfy your curious mind. Chris Demp here. Thanks so much for tuning in wherever you are. Listen, first I want to say I hope you're having a terrific 2018. I hope your year's off to a great start. And before we get into this week's episode, I want to say if you haven't listened to our last episode, be sure to go do that. The beginning of the year is such a great time to start something new, and I think our last episode will prompt you to try out some new things, potentially cold showers, and see the benefits. And the only reason I'm saying that is because it's been over a month now since I interviewed Scott Carney. I have added the cold shower finish to the end of all of my showers, and I have to say, I now look forward to freezing cold water at the end of my shower. I know it's insane, but it feels incredible. So go listen to that. You'll know what I'm talking about and give it a shot. On to this week. I'm excited to bring this episode to you because I have to admit, history was one of those subjects in school that I just never really got into. And now I appreciate it so much greater. So when I get an incredible historian and academic on this show that can really bring history to life and then show me how it can help us all in the present, is something I relish. This week on the show, we interview Harvard Business School historian Nancy Koehn. Nancy is the author of the new best-selling book, Forged in Crisis: The Power of Courageous Leadership in Turbulent Times. Now, I know leadership is a hot topic, but it's actually one that I've been trying to steer away from a little bit, just given the saturation. However, this book and Nancy's message is so unique and so valuable, I had to talk to her. What Nancy did is she utilized her skills as a world-renowned historian to look at some of the finest leaders of all time, evaluate the crisis and the turbulence that they went through, and uncover what it was that made them great in the most difficult circumstances. These 5 leaders include polar explorer Ernest Shackleton, President Abraham Lincoln, legendary abolitionist Frederick Douglass, Nazi-resisting clergyman Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and environmental crusader Rachel Carson. So as always, in this episode, we're going to get that Cliff's Notes version of what she uncovered as she studied the lives of these 5 incredible leaders. And I truly believe that these lessons can be applied instantly in all of our lives today to be more resilient, to push through challenges, and to, of course, come out on the other side a more well-rounded, impactful, empathetic, and respected leader. We also talk a little bit about what it is to be a historian, how that happens, and also, again, one of those themes I always like to bring in, what is it like to follow that passion you have, whether it be historian, athlete, author, and to make up your mind that you're just going to go for it. So something I really wanted to get Nancy's take on. Before I turn it over to the interview, I have only one thing to mention. We are opening this up to our listeners. We want to talk to you. We want to hear from you. We want to learn how we can provide more value to you. So if you really enjoy the show and you want to help us make it better, I want to get on the phone or on Skype or even just on email with you. Please reach out to us at smartpeoplepodcast@gmail.com and help us make this a more valuable experience for you, everyone else, and let's see what this can become. So again, email us at smartpeoplepodcast@gmail.com. Let's get on with it and learn how to lead through turbulent times and how to grow through crises as we talk to Nancy Koehn about her new book, Forged in Crisis. Enjoy. All right. Well, Nancy, first, I just want to say thanks so much for taking the time out of your busy marketing schedule to be on the show.
It's my sincere pleasure, Chris.
You are, first and foremost, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you're an academic. So how do you feel about the whole write a book, market it, kind of wearing all these hats?
Well, I'm a historian, and we're not, we don't get PhDs in marketing, but I grew up, my second job almost, immediately out of finishing my doctorate was at the Harvard Business School, an institution of, consistent pragmatism and organizational capability. So I cut my teeth in some sense as I grew into my own professional, muscles and sense of proportion. I grew up learning about the importance of communicating worthy missions and worthy messages. And so this piece of the book authorship process, was in some very real sense completely expected, and if not welcomed, assumed to be an important part of the responsibility I bear in trying to bring the book into the world. So I'm not always, skipping right along the cobblestones of travel for a book tour or jumping up and down about the possibilities of relaying my message, for the sixth time on a given day. But I believe in what these five people whose stories are told here have to offer us, all kinds of people at this moment and, across a longer time span. And so that part of how do I bring my child into the world in an effective, and courageous way is something that I feel that I have to do and I want to do from that place.
Right. And I'm glad you kind of mentioned all of that. There's so many areas I want to cover, but the first one, just to let even the listeners know, I was so pleasantly surprised. Here's what your book was to me. Your book to me was the reason every history professor told me I should pay attention in class, and I still didn't. But I wish I would have. They say, right, history, part of it is so that we don't make the same mistakes. And you really, you highlight, like, we deal with crises often as a species. And there have been people who have dealt with it the right way and come out on the other end. Here's their lessons.
Yeah, well, again, let's go back to the crucible in which the book was born. And that is, and my own, the greenhouse that helped, shape me as a historian. And that was being at a school where you're teaching, students who are poised for action, and you're teaching executives who live completely in the world of action. So Chris, the folks that go to Harvard Business School don't go there to learn history.
Right. Great point.
But let's go back to your comment at the top of the question. They understand, as Mark Twain once said, that history doesn't repeat itself precisely, but sometimes it does rhyme. So they are interested in the rhymes of history. So my challenge has always been, how do I reconstruct the historical truth, which is a painstaking, in many, many ways, boring and arduous process, and at the same time make what I discover, the truth of the past, interesting and vibrant to people, ready to jump out of their seats and do something. And that is something, I think that is the great gift of history I've come to realize. What do we learn from the past? What do we learn from the struggles and the triumphs of other people at other moments that we can use today because their moment has these similarities or their journey has these, rhymes with our own journeys and our own moment. And so that's a huge gas tank, maybe the most important gas tank that fuels this book, because it's the gas tank that fuels me and all the work I've done in my 30s, 40s, and now into my 50s. So I want people to grab at those lessons. I want people to grab at those similarities. I want people from teenagers to, senators and everybody in between say, boy, here's how Ernest Shackleton, the Antarctic explorer, matters to me. Or, oh, I wonder what Rachel Carson, the environmental activist and crusader, would have done in this moment. And I found these people to speak to my own life that way in so many ways. It's my privilege to help others open that door if they can find these stories compelling and useful.
That last sentence makes a lot of sense because, I mean, now as I get more curious, it's much more important. But when I was in college, I remember just thinking, how do I get through this class? I really do. And what was lost on me, and what you mentioned there, is how do you make it pertinent as a professor? I mean, yes, you're a historian, but teaching at Harvard, it's your job to take this critical aspect of being human and learning and all this and delivering it in a way that makes it relevant, interesting, and shows the use of it. But for me, that's hard as it relates to history as opposed to math, science, things you can utilize right now.
You know, maybe it is, but for those of us that, you know, choose, and we're historians that choose to bring history to life in a very practicable way, as you and I are talking about. And we're a small handful. Most historians in traditional history departments, in high schools, in colleges, in other places of learning, right, are studying the past on its own terms for its own reasons. And then you have a really big, if you will, gauntlet or glove on the ground to pick up, which is how do you make that sing to people, especially in an age where our attention spans are shrinking and, you know, we just want to get on our phone as soon as we can and see what's happening there. But for a small handful of us who, you know, including writers who write biographies in a way that helps people make the stories useful today, right? For those of us that do this, it's incredibly satisfying work. It's not that hard in that if you're paying attention to both the past and the present. I'm always toggling back and forth every single day. You know, woke up this morning thinking about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the fourth story in this book, the Nazi resistor, this clergyman who really, you know, got more and more involved in trying to resist Nazi evil throughout his life in the 1930s and early 40s. And, you know, I woke up and then I got on the New York Times website and I started thinking about what's happening today. That's my life. I move almost seamlessly between the past and the present. And when you live like that, it's a joy to bring what you see as viable, truthful rhymes of the past and other people in the past to the present. And so I do this with pep in my step, Chris.
Yeah. You might be the first historian we've ever had on, which is really cool. And that means that's a blind spot of mine. So for those of us that don't, know, would you tell us what a historian is and what motivated you to be one?
A historian is a person who commits their time and energy to uncovering the puzzle of the past, right? To piecing together all those little bits that comprise a certain person's life, a particular moment in history, right? The second chapter in the books of Abraham Lincoln. So I spent years, right, reconstructing his journey from the inside out, because as you know, this book is about the emotional experience of these leaders. That's the foundation of the stories. But also I was reconstructing, in edible fashion, right, the larger stage of the runway to the Civil War and then the Civil War itself. So it's someone who commits to reconstructing, putting together the pieces of the puzzle of a particular moment or a particular person's life in light of a series of important questions. Historians don't just set out to say, well, I'm going to describe the Renaissance or I'm going to describe, the early 1960s in America. They set out to answer a series of questions about a particular moment. And then they use, with painstaking care, they assemble the historical sources. The pieces of the puzzle are diaries, archives full of letters, government memorandum, if you're trying to understand, for example, the Cuban Missile Crisis, another fascinating, relevant moment in history to our own turbulent time. They are working with the residue and the breadcrumbs of all kinds of documents and other media in modern times. That can be television, it can be newspaper clippings, it can be magazine articles. They're using all the residue of the past, the evidence left by people and institutions from the past to try and piece together that puzzle in a way that has the integrity of what really happened. What's the integrity of what really happened? Well, that's your very, very best and other historians' very best attempts to put that puzzle together. So historians are detectives. There's the short answer.
Right.
Detectives of the past. If you think about some great movies like Oliver Stone's JFK, one of the people in that movie says, it's an enigma, it's a mystery wrapped in an enigma. So historians are detectives trying to unwrap that mystery within the enigma and figure out what really was. And so it's a journey of questing and sniffing and snooping and overturning stones. And I became a historian because I was in a great books program many years ago at Stanford University, and it was an extraordinary program, and it really unveiled for us, the 60 of us freshmen who were in that program, some of the really pressing, big, hairy, fascinating questions that have animated man's search for meaning for 2,000 years. That was the goal of the class, to really take a look at some of the most important questions men and women have confronted in the last 2,000 years. And when I finished graduate work at the Kennedy School, a master's in public policy, and dabbled in the idea of getting involved in politics, which is something I considered in my early 20s, I realized there were a bunch of really interesting questions that I hadn't fully explored. And so I went back. I thought, where can I explore those? Well, history is a huge, wide open canvas. It allows you to study all kinds of big, intersecting, overlapping, integrated, multidisciplinary interrogatives. And so I said, it was very naive. I said, if I can get an institution to help pay for this, because I had a lot of student debt already, I'm going to go back to I'm going to go do graduate work in history. And I loved it from the moment I became a graduate student. I never studied history per se in college. I started. I was really a newbie. I was very unusual in that I was the only graduate student in my program who hadn't been a history major, but I loved it. I was like a kid in a candy shop, and that same love is still very much with me today. It has not abated. It has not gotten jaded. I have not been jilted by my lover history. I am joyful in my embrace of the excitement and energy and relevance of the detective stories I get to try and piece together for people today.
When you're staring down the idea of becoming a historian, which, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but doesn't carry a lot of obvious career paths, how do you reconcile the reality of that profession, the worry, if any, about the stability of that profession versus the passion you had for the subject?
Oh, it's a huge struggle. It's a huge struggle, particularly for doctoral students, right? And for the decision to go to graduate school. And it was a struggle when I went into the graduate program at Harvard many, many years ago. This was in the mid 80s. There were very, very few jobs then as now for PhDs in history. There are a small number fewer now, but we're talking from reductions from a tiny base. So it was a huge worry. My father practically disowned me. He thought it was so impractical to do this when I announced I was going to go to do doctoral work in history. And yet, the answer, so yes, I think it's a very big concern. It's a great, it poses a kind of existential crisis, I think, for lots of historians or lots of folks thinking about history, and for lots of other folks thinking about other careers in fields that, as you said, Chris, are not, it's not immediately obvious. It's not even, in some cases, obvious at all how you're going to piece together a living by following a great passion. For me, it was, as a few other times in my life, not a lot, a few other times in my life, it was what, Søren Kierkegaard once called a leap of faith. It was a leap of faith to do this. I loved it. I knew it felt right for me. I couldn't get right with myself if I turned my back on that and went into, economics, which was something my father thought I should do, because then I could get a job either go to law school, or I could get a job doing something in business. And that just didn't feel right. And so I tell my students today, and I have many students that aren't at the business school, so my business school students are set up better than many to get a job. But my students at the Kennedy School, my students from the college, from Harvard College, they're not so well placed in terms of their money making power when they get done with school. And I say to them, you have to really decide what you're passionate about and how much you believe in that passion. Because I have learned over the years that people who follow their passion, do their best work, gain a great deal of confidence, and get right with themselves earlier. And all those things, Chris, I think help. And this is from years of watching all kinds of young people, right, go up, grow into themselves. All those kinds of things, the passion, the joy, the confidence, the sense of being right with who you are, all those things actually turn out to be accelerants, right? They turn out to be, gas pedals on your way to doing well practically.
Yeah,
makes sense. It's not that you can't do well by doing something that's not joyous, that's not, right for you. All kinds of people do. But what we miss when we say, oh, you're never going to get a job doing something like that, even though you love it, is that loving something immediately ups the odds significantly of your doing well at it. And people that love what they do find a way to do it and do it at a high level. And that usually 9 times out of 10 gets rewarded practically. So it's a more roundabout path, but it's a more satisfying path too. I've discovered watching myself, but also watching lots and lots of other people. So again, not for the faint of heart, and I'm often faint of heart, but I wasn't in this respect. But we can choose when to screw our courage to the sticking post, as Shakespeare said, right? And I did in that instance, and it has served me very well.
As we were talking about this, I couldn't help but think about the parallels between even this decision, which so many people face, including yourself, including most people listening, of, when to do what they want and taking that tough path, and then the leadership that you talk about in your book, Forged in Crisis. Albeit to different extents, maybe, but it's like everyone faces those moments and can take away from those stories that you tell in this book.
Yeah, that's a great catch. It's a great pull out, Chris. Each of these people, for your listeners that haven't encountered the book, right? The Antarctic explorer Ernest Shackleton, whose ship goes down off the coast of Antarctica in 1915, leaving him and his 27-man crew, completely marooned on a floating iceberg, with very little more than the leader's will to survive and get his men home safely to help them do that. And then the second story, the story of Abraham Lincoln holding himself and the nation together in the perfect storm of the Civil War. The third story, Frederick Douglass, the escaped slave and abolitionist who did as much as Lincoln to transform America and rid the nation of slavery. The fourth story that most of your listeners, at least in my experience, probably haven't encountered, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, this clergyman who became so active in the resistance against Hitler in Germany. And then last, but by no means least, the only woman in the book, and in some ways, to me, the most amazing leader, Rachel Carson, who wrote Silent Spring, the book that really, more than any other single action, founded or helped found the modern environmental movement. All of these people face exactly these kinds of crossroads, right? They find themselves often in a kind of crisis. It's not, it may be an identity crisis, as what we're talking about is, or it may be a health crisis, or it may be, a life and death crisis like Shackleton, they all find themselves unexpectedly, suddenly in, in a storm with high winds and big waves, and they all have to dig deep to discover and then access their own muscles of resilience and courage and sense of what the right path is, what the higher, stronger road is going forward, and then to climb or claw or, kind of hike themselves up on that road. And that is really the animating to your, keen insight about the book. That is really the animating chord or symphony of the book. How do people, the power of courageous leadership in turbulent times, how do people forge themselves in the midst of crisis into stronger, braver, right, more decent people and more luminous people with the capability of making a great impact? That is really the essence of the book. And we all, to come back finally to your animating remark, Chris, we all, right, face these moments in our lives. And we don't face just one, we face a number of them usually. We can't predict when they'll come or how quickly they'll happen in succession. But we all face them, and we can't avoid them. And the question isn't the existence of ourselves, of finding ourselves in a crisis, the existence of these storms. The question is, what will we do with the moment? Because we can't usually control the fact that we end up in a crisis, right? What we can have agency over is what in the heck will we do, and how will we make something good of ourselves in all that difficulty, in all that calamity.
Right. Absolutely. And I want to pick out one or two of these and kind of dive a little deeper. But before you do that, I had a question that popped into my brain earlier, and I said, oh my gosh, I have to ask Nancy this, because I've always wondered, how right can we be? And at what point do we start losing that accuracy? How spot on can we be about the nuances, right? Which you're kind of uncovering, the emotions, the relationships, the struggles, things like that. How right can historians get it to help us relive those moments? And also, how far back does it start becoming difficult?
The answer is you can get very, very good, because if you have very, very good evidence, the puzzle pieces, the breadcrumbs, the residue are there. So one of the reasons these 5 people, I've been at Harvard Business School for 26 years. I've been studying leaders since I got there. And so I've been exposed to all kinds of leaders, past and present. And, one of the reasons these 5 ended up in the book is because these people and their moment had left that evidence. So I knew I wanted to do something around the emotional, the inner life of leaders in crisis. So I had to pick people that had left or for whom there was this kind of evidence. So if the evidence is there, the time period itself doesn't matter. So, for example, we can uncover a great deal about Ernest Shackleton's inner life, because he left a diary and all of his men kept diaries and notes. Mm-hmm. So we know a lot, and they're not little diaries that say 12/6/1915, tried to crack open the ice on the iceberg. They're diaries that are about his frustrations, his sense of his men, his own turmoil, right? Put footstep of patience into stirrup of courage, right? We have that. If the evidence exists, the time period matters much, much less. The critical thing is, are the breadcrumbs there? So that's, and how hard is it to do? It's as hard as uncovering or piecing together any mystery. The more complicated the story, the harder it is to do. But that all depends a great deal on the diligence and ingenuity and, if you will, kind of sheer sweat equity of the historian. Because think about the best detective stories you've read. Think about Sherlock Holmes, or some of the great detectives of our literary lives. These were people who never gave up. Columbo, remember the Columbo? Some of your listeners will, right? Peter Falk's character never gave up trying to figure out who did it and why and how. And so this book took 15 years for me to write. Now, part of that time I was recovering from my own series of unexpected crises and trying to forge myself first into survival and then into something better. And so that took up a lot of time, but a great deal of the last half of that time period was spent not dashing off, blog posts. It was spent sitting in my study surrounded by books and diaries and digital, correspondence as I tried to figure out what was going on here. So it just takes a great deal of time, but it is eminently doable given a rich historical record. And that's a big, big bar. It's a high bar because lots and lots of interesting folks don't leave interesting records. And sometimes the worse their emotional situation, the more likely they are to have covered it up or burned those diaries,
right?
Burned those papers. So the big if is about the breadcrumbs, and the second big if is how serious and how committed is the historian, and how much time do they have? Are they willing to expend to try and piece it together?
This week's episode is brought to you by Casper Mattresses. Casper is a sleep brand that continues to revolutionize its line of products to create an exceptionally comfortable sleep experience one night at a time. With 3 mattress models, the original Casper, the Wave, and the Essential, Casper mattresses are perfectly designed to soothe and cradle your natural geometry. Not to mention, the breathable design helps you sleep cool and regulates your body temperature throughout the night. And it's delivered right to your door in a small, how did they do that sized box with free shipping and returns in the US and Canada. But the best part is, you can be sure of your purchase with Casper's 100-night risk-free sleep on it trial. After all, you spend 1/3 of your life sleeping, so you should be comfortable. Here's what we're offering to listeners of Smart People Podcast. Start sleeping ahead of the curve with Casper. Get $50 towards select mattresses by visiting casper.com/smart and using SMART at checkout. That's casper.com/smart and offer code SMART for $50 off your mattress purchase. Terms and conditions apply. And now back to the episode.
As I mentioned, I do want to go into these. There's just so many questions I have for you. And I hate to ask the obvious, but for those that haven't heard it before, let me just ask, what have you found in your research in studying these 5 people to be the unifying themes of strong leadership in the middle of crisis?
No, it's good. It's an important question, and really important, and it cannot be asked enough. So 3 things really, 3 fundamental aspects of how does a leader do the work that he or she must in order to first navigate. You're doing 2 things in a crisis. You're navigating through the waters, the dangerous waters. And then you're also steering toward a better place, right? It's not just survive, it's survive and then thrive. Or it's not just, right, save the country, save the company, save the environment. It's also how do you transform that organization or that entity into something that can be better, stronger, much more capable of accomplishing its mission. So you're doing both things. So 3 themes to navigating and then heading toward the North Star of, or as I like to say, pushing the boulder of goodness forward. Because each of these stories, Chris, as you know, is not about people who just accomplished a mission through, and made themselves capable of doing something extraordinary. These are ordinary people who make themselves in crisis capable of doing something extraordinary. These are also people who do it toward a worthy, right, benevolent, universally good outcome, mission. So, lots of people say, well, why don't you write about Genghis Khan to me because he was a successful leader? I'm not. We have plenty of stories of base leaders who are playing to all of our weaker selves. The world does not need more of those stories.
Right.
The world needs stories of people who found their morals, their muscles of moral courage in order to do something good. So these are 5 people who did that. And here are the 3, if you will, I think, unifying themes. They apply to people in all walks of life trying to move the boulder of goodness forward, from librarians to chemo nurses to school principals to policemen and women. First, right, you need to stumble into, see from, a shining divine light, discover early on, right, grab out of the ether. You need to find a worthy purpose, right? So each of these people had a worthy purpose. They could never have forged themselves into such strong leaders, courageous leaders, without the purpose. So the purpose itself is important. And it helps sustain them, by the way, in some of their darkest hours when they want to give it all up and tumble over the edge of the cliff into doubt and despair and giving up. Second, the leader, the person, the mother, the principal, the congressman, the activist, the podcast, right, host, makes a decision in the midst of all this difficulty and confusion within themselves to make something good of the moment. That's a pact. It's a covenant. It can be indirect. It can be direct, but it has to be made. And it is in all these instances and over again in these people, in these stories. You make a pact somehow. I'm not going to be a victim. I'm not going to get bitter. I'm not going to get smaller. And by hook or crook, even if I don't know how, I'm going to make something good of this and of myself. So the second piece is a covenant or a pact or a meeting with oneself. And the third piece is that out of the darkness, the dark night of the soul, right, that is a crisis, in all way, for all of us, at some moment, we sit in the dark, we wander around in the wilderness or in the dark night of the soul. In the midst of that, we find a way to harness our emotional awareness. So our big tool for embracing the mission, right, for finding our worthy purpose and then moving it forward, for making ourselves better and not smaller and a victim and bitter in the midst of a crisis. The key tool here is the third theme, and that is a huge amount depends on our emotional awareness. We don't teach this in most leadership academies. We don't do enough of it with Harvard Business School. We don't hear leaders talking about it. But man, oh man, we sure know when we encounter a leader who's operating from his or her foundation of emotional awareness. And then leading, that means from the inside out. So think about someone like Martin Luther King, whose light and inner power were some of his most important tools, right? Think about someone like Nelson Mandela. Think about someone like Robert Kennedy. Think about someone like Abraham Lincoln. Think about someone like, Marion Wright Edelman, who runs the Children's Defense League. These are all people. Think about someone like Melinda Gates, who really runs the Gates Foundation. These are people who are operating not from a command of policy and practicable answers. They have that. But what their real power, their real ability to motivate and inspire others to join them and thus really make a difference in the world, what their real power is their own sense of emotional awareness and how to use that to connect with the mission and connect with other people to help them execute on the mission. So, mission, covenant with oneself to get bigger and more luminous and stronger, not smaller and bitter and more of a victim. And third, my greatest tool for in those other two aspects is my own sense of emotional awareness and emotional discipline I can use with myself and connect with others to really try and advance that mission or that purpose.
Sometimes we can hear what these 5 individuals have done, or even the people you mentioned, and say, look, I don't have that strong a why. I'm never going to do this big thing. Or even if I'm not going to, I don't plan to. That's not my goal, right? What do you say to the people that feel almost like they can't relate given the size or scope of the aspirations of these leaders that you highlight?
It's a great question. So this book is not about how do I become Abraham Lincoln or how do I become Rachel Carson, right, who's battling metastasizing cancer while she's trying to finish this, what she knows is a really important book. how do I become Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who's involved as a spy in the Nazi government trying to assassinate Hitler and overthrow the Third Reich? That's not the message of the book. It's not about how do I become these people. The animating theme of the book, and I know because I have none of the chapters went into the book without being test marketed, if you will, over and over again with all kinds of students and executives and healthcare leaders. So this book has been read and experienced in many forms by thousands of people over the last 10 years. And I've seen all kinds of leaders and leaders that aren't yet formed relate to it. So the big theme of the book at an infrastructure level is leaders come in all shapes and sizes. At one point in one of these stories, I talk about how mothers, right, trying to steer a troubled child through a difficult period are some of our most important leaders, or firefighters are leaders, or nurses are leaders. I've had cancer a couple of times, and let me tell you, some of the strongest, most courageous people I have ever encountered as leaders were the nurses who helped me through some of the hardest physical experiences I've ever been through in the treatment of cancer. So this book is for all of us, and the lessons and the insights that each of these people learn can be applied as much to how do I work up the courage to ask my boss for a promotion, to how do I try and feed hungry men and women in the Middle East, to how do I work for water rights in sub-Saharan Africa, to how do I lead my sales force with more integrity and engagement and sense of a good higher road purpose. This is not a book about how to be someone in marble. It's about a book about how to be your best self, who you're meant to be. That's what this book is.
Yeah.
Who are you meant to be? This book is written for every person who wants to explore that question.
Yeah. And, I'm going to bring this into something that I talk about, I utilize in my work, and many of the listeners know this, but so I teach workshops for a company called Franklin Covey, and Dr. Covey wrote 7 Habits.
Yeah.
And one of the things that he taught me was this idea of the character ethic versus the personality ethic. And through his work, he basically looked back about 200 years on as much literature as he could find about leadership, and found that starting in about 1800 all the way up to 1950, so about 150 years, what he found leadership was defined as, or a lot of the strong leaders focused on who they were, their foundation, their character, what made them an individual. Only in the last 50 years, so 1950 to 2000 about, he saw a big shift towards leaders focusing on how they appeared, right? Who liked them, kind of what their actions were on the surface, what to do, the tips, tricks, as opposed to who they were. I found that exactly to be what you noticed in these people. I mean, especially Shackleton, Lincoln, even Douglass, right? The focus on themselves as an individual, how they take care of themselves, how they present themselves with honesty and integrity and motivation, and was where they focused. Not what can I say to manipulate the situation. Was that obviously apparent to you?
Yes, it is. I'd not heard Mr. Covey's distinction. I think it's apt before you mentioned it. So one appetizer to the answer. So many years ago, David Foster Wallace, the American
I love that guy. Yeah.
Novelist, had this definition of leadership to offer in an article he wrote in the Rolling Stone. And I've used it. I used it in the introduction of the book, and it has animated my thinking for well over a decade about the definition of leadership. Real leaders, David Foster Wallace writes, are individuals who help us overcome the limitations of our own weaknesses, selfishness, laziness, and fears, and get us to do harder, better things than we can get ourselves to do on our own. Right? Leaders are individuals who help us overcome the limitations of our own weaknesses, selfishness, laziness, and fears, and get us to do harder, better things than we can get ourselves to do on our own. Now, I think that captures a whole lot about courageous, real leaders. We're longing for more of those people today in our elected politics at the national level. No matter which party you're from, we're longing for that. And I think that these people became those leaders, these 5 people. I think I've studied many, many other leaders who became real, courageous leaders of the same definition, of the same ilk, and they did it from the inside out, right? So what Covey is saying is leadership used to begin with the inside of the leader. And then inside out, who you are, what... See, real leadership is ultimately about 2 things. It's about character and it's about competence.
Yeah.
Right? Character and competence are related. So how can we talk about leadership if we're not talking about, the guts and the heartbeat and the integrity and the formation of people from the inside out? So this book proceeds from the inside out in terms of these stories of leaders. Having said that, and yet, having said that, each of these people, like everyone that's listening to this podcast, knows that you can't live solely from the inside out. You have to understand the larger stage. You have to understand the simple fact that as a leader, whether you're a mother or a father or a doctor or a traffic warden, people's eyes are on you. So you have to show up, right, with a sense of that responsibility, with your stronger, better side. You got to show up, even if you don't always feel like showing up as, a stronger, better version of yourself. And you got to move people's hearts and minds. You have to interact on this large external stage. So all of these people understand that fully well. And some of the most interesting lessons in the book that these people learn are about how they learn to do that. That being said, the basis, the foundation, the mother lode, right? The absolute center of each of these stories and each of these people remains their character and their competence and how they affect those 2 elements, those essential pair of elements as they walk through their journey trying to make themselves better. So they're working on themselves. So Mr. Covey would say great leaders are always working on themselves.
Oh, yeah.
These, like anyone that's going to live a satisfying life, you're going to decide somewhere along the line, and it's going to be a decision for the rest of your life, that you're going to keep working on making yourself better. And these people do. And how they do that is part of, I think, one of the most interesting and digestible series of nuggets in the book, is a very important part of the book.
You do such a great job of humanizing these folks, but also showing the side of them that is superhuman. And what I mean is, I think we need to highlight the fact that, these leaders got depressed, they cried, they struggled, they probably had even more going on internally, and physical ills, which come from this. I just think it's really critical to recognize that they weren't superhuman going into it. It's only the willingness to come out the other side, which is why the title, Forged in Crisis.
I have learned, partly because this is what has made me so interested and engaged, compelled by history. I have learned that the more human the person in a particular moment in the past, the more interesting they are. So these stories are ultimately about the very humanity of each of these individuals. Everything from, what kind of food Lincoln liked to eat, to the fact that he told, raunchy stories late at night when he couldn't sleep, to, Rachel Carson being absolutely gaga about her cats, right? These stories are about the whole person, warts and all, including their fears. I mean, you mentioned these are people who want to give up. They're full of doubt at moments. They grow deeply depressed. Each of them, they wander around at moments in confusion and uncertainty. They also scared a lot, each of them. And in that sense, all of these aspects of the stories are much more similar to you and I and to the rest of your listeners than they are different. So these are people who are acting from, living in, leading from their humanity. None of them, I think, would ever think of themselves as superhuman. And I don't think of them as superhuman. I think of them as demonstrative of, good evidence for what we are capable of, what we are each capable of when we make decisions and commit to them, because a big part of these stories is these people in the moments of doubt, in the moments of fear, in the moments of depression, don't give up, right? When we commit to leading from our stronger side as best we can, because we can't do it all the time, right? When we do that, we are capable of amazing, amazing things. I just finished this biography of Robert Kennedy, and Teddy Kennedy at his brother's funeral in June of 1968 says, my brother liked this quote, some people dream dreams and ask why not. My brother always asked why not. These people, keep saying, why not? Not how do I move a mountain, not how do I part the clouds or the seas, but rather, why not? Why can't I try to do this? And by the way, the doing of it, the constant work to make oneself better is messy, difficult, right? Exhausting work that all of us can relate to as the stuff of some of the most challenging and important moments in our life. So it's messy. This book is about the mess of the messiness of becoming who we're meant to be. But it's not a story about superhumans. The story of these people, and the reason we remember the stories is because ultimately the stories are about how they did it by hook or crook, and often 2 steps forward, 1 big step back. So I hope readers come away, as I know many of them have. I've had teenagers read this book and say, gosh, if Ernest Shackleton can do this, I can do this.
Right.
That's what I want. If Rachel Carson could do this while she's, incapacitated physically by cancer, then I can certainly do this for my mission with my capabilities. That's what I hope people will make their own as they read the stories. It's not about leaping tall buildings in a single bound or a red cape.
Yeah. And, Nancy, I know we need to let you go, but I just had my own little epiphany. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw it out there, but I really, if you don't agree, just based on everything you've learned, pick it apart a little bit. As a society, with all of the technology, with all of the instant gratification and also constant coverage, I think we're actually propagating the outside-in leadership. I think we are actually forcing leaders to be less effective because of the fact they're always visible. Every part of their lives is picked apart and instantaneously spread to everyone, that when they show those cracks, when they have a human moment, when they go play with their cats and look like a crazy cat person, or they cry, or they go into depression, we instantly write them off as a leader and they're done. So what that's telling others is you cannot be human. You can't show this side. You can't actually be who you are. And therefore, we spend all of our efforts on how we appear, much less on doing the hard work inside, and we never get to build the proper way.
I agree with you. 2 postscripts to what you just said. I agree with you. And one of the lessons of the book, or actually I say this in different forms in a couple of places as lessons, is how important it is to have time for reflection, how important it is to put your phone away, how important it is to stop thinking that the answers to the pressing problems of our country, our global village, our own lives are not scrolling our phones. The answers aren't there. It's not that our phones aren't useful in certain ways, but we're assuming that the answers are there, as well as our own, ability to make ourselves emotionally aware, disciplined, forbearing, decent, luminous. They're not there at all. We're barking up the wrong tree. So I think that first postscript, right? Reflection, time alone, plenty of time spent in the wilderness, right? In the small boat navigating the highways is actually really important. Second, it's not just our public leaders that I think are being made less effective. I think each of us is, because we're all meant to lead in some way that's relevant and compelling for ourselves. We're all meant to play a leadership role, but if we're only thinking about, from the outside in, we're not going to discover that mission. We're not going to discover that path or that role. So I think it's diminishing all of our capacities to lead. And then the last thing I would say is, when we encounter a leader that does allow him or herself to be vulnerable. I don't know if you had a chance to read Salma Hayek. I'm going to pronounce that wrong. Hayek's piece in the New York Times yesterday where she's talking about her own experience in Hollywood. She's talking about Harvey Weinstein, but she's really talking about feeling incredibly vulnerable and self-hating in the moment of feeling like she's not worth very much and she doesn't have any power. And it's been very high on the most read stories. I have no doubt that millions of people will read this and think a little bit differently about themselves and about her, and what she's doing. And the point is that there's a person who's very thoughtfully, right, very, very carefully, with great time and reflection, decided to expose her vulnerabilities. It's not a piece primarily pointing the finger at Harvey Weinstein. It's a piece about what she experienced. And it's done carefully and courageously and with an eye to how do we raise the bar for each of ourselves and especially for decorum and how we treat each other in our society. So there's a place for leaders to lead literally from their own vulnerability in a thoughtful, careful, reflective way toward a higher purpose. And that may be some of the silver lining of all this exposure and social media and living in glass houses. But again, it can't be primarily reactive. It's not an angry tweet.
Right.
It can't be that. That does damage. We have to have something that uplifts, that, makes us better, helps us do better, harder things than we can do on our own.
I couldn't agree more. I think the book is so relevant and just so necessary for a million reasons. One, for me, it just reignited kind of a passion for a subject that I would say I was least passionate about when I think about college, but it does it in the way that I like learning through stories, but through really intricate detail. Really appreciate it. Forged in Crisis: The Power of Courageous Leadership in Turbulent Times is the book. Nancy, where else are you? What's on the horizon, or are you writing elsewhere? Where can our listeners go to really dig in?
A couple of places to dig in. So on Amazon, at the bottom of the web page for the book, right, you get on the Amazon, you search for the title. At the very bottom are 5 short videos for everyone trying to be a better leader in whatever walk of life they're in. So that I put together like a little leadership course. You can see it at the bottom of the page on Amazon. Whether you buy the book or not, I hope it'll be interesting. These are short, like 3 or 4 minute videos. The book has its own website that has a whole bunch more videos and tips and, leadership lessons. That's forgedincrisis.com. And then last but not least, my personal website, which is actually a house. It's a house and you navigate through the rooms, discover interesting things for yourself, interesting lessons, readings, videos, tidbits, is nancykoehn.com. So any of those places will take you, whether you buy the book or not, to some of the diamonds in the rough in terms of helping you be better and stronger and more who you're meant to be in a quick and accessible way.
Nancy, thank you so much for your time. This was a fantastic conversation. Can't wait to get this out to our listeners. Best of luck.
Terrific. Thanks, Chris. I really appreciate you doing this for me.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Bye.
All righty. Bye-bye.
Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed that interview with Nancy Koehn. Nancy's book, Forged in Crisis: The Power of Courageous Leadership in Turbulent Times, can be found at your local bookstore and on Amazon. And as always, if you're going to purchase the book through Amazon, please use the Smart People Podcast Amazon link located at smartpeoplepodcast.com/Amazon. Using our link comes to no extra cost to you, and it greatly helps support the show. If you're looking for other free and easy ways to support the show, please head over to iTunes or Apple Podcasts and leave a rating and review over there. If you'd like to reach out to the show, you can email us at smartpeoplepodcast@gmail.com or message us on Twitter @smartpeoplepod. All right, listen up. We really want to hear from those that love the show. So if you love Smart People Podcast, send us an email at smartpeoplepodcast@gmail.com. We want to get in touch with you. We want to ask you why you listen to the show and just pick your brain a little bit. So again, if you love the show, reach out to us, smartpeoplepodcast@gmail.com. That's it for us this week. Remember, you can head over to smartpeoplepodcast.com to check out all the old episodes and sign up for the newsletter. We've got some great interviews coming up, so make sure you stay tuned, and we will see you all next episode.